Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Besseling. It is a real pleasure to be joining you today. I am the Executive Director at Risk Advisory AXX Africa. We provide analysis and forecasts on political, security, and economic risk throughout the African continent. Therefore, it seems apt for me to introduce the topic of Africa emerging from the pandemic and looking forward to 2021. Looking at some of the key sectors that can provide opportunities or indeed continued threats and perils as we move into next year. Now, I'd like to start off by talking about the economic impact of COVID-19 in Africa. And if we take a look at the virus's infections rates over the past few months on the African continent, you can see here that Africa is approaching 1.7 million infections at the moment in cumulative total. However, only about 250,000 of those are actually active. The death rate throughout Africa has also remained relatively low at around 2 or 3% in most African countries. About 2 months ago, South Africa accounted for the vast majority of new and cumulative cases throughout the African continent. However, over the past few months, it is the Maghreb countries of Egypt and Morocco that have again seen a surge in infections, particularly in Morocco over the past month or so. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the countries with the highest number of infections actually have the biggest impact on their economy. If we look at the top 10 best performing African economies in 2020, Egypt, with one of the highest rates of infection across Africa, accounting for about 6% of African infections on a cumulative basis, actually will be the only large African economy set to grow at a rather astute rate in 2020. And with a continued growth forecast for the foreseeable future. This is mostly because of IMF support, including a new program that was recently agreed with the fund, as well as the continuation of major mega projects in terms of infrastructure and LNG. Other African countries that are set to record some sort of GDP growth this year include the more economically diversified markets on the east and west sides of Africa. These include small economies like Benin and Senegal, but also Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire and Kenya. And even Ghana, which has seen a drop in oil revenues, has been able to offset this with an increase in revenues from the mining sector. So good news to a certain extent for many of these countries as they ride into 2021. So which are the countries that are indeed at the highest risk of some sort of a country risk destabilization because of the pandemic? Well, if we take a look at ex-Africa's country risk outlook for Africa, this map here is based on our quantitative and forward-looking risk forecasting methodology, whereby we look at political, security, economic, and sovereign debt perils for each African country. And here you can see the cumulative total color-coded according to each different country. Now, at the beginning of the year, we did have a number of African countries in the blue low risk category. We are hoping that as we move into 2021, and a number of these countries, again, particularly Rwanda, Benin, or Senegal, will be able to move back into the lower risk blue category. Most African countries, however, at least for now, remain in the severe red or high orange categories. And that's not just because of the pandemic. For example, we have a number of key elections coming up in the last quarter of 2020 and moving into 2021. One of these is Ivory Coast. Cote d'Ivoire will hold its first round of elections on the 31st of October. And due to a spate of localized violence and ethnic unrest, the elections outlook has been rather turbulent. Indeed, it still remains to be seen whether the election will actually proceed on the foreseen date, and to what extent the opposition will proceed with its civil disobedience and boycott strategy. If the election were to go to a second round around Christmas time, this would be the time where we would see the highest risk of political and potentially ethnic unrest. Another country that will host elections at the end of this year is Ghana. As I mentioned earlier, Ghana will be able to achieve moderate growth over in 2020. However, at the beginning of the year, the incumbent government of Nana Akufo-Addo was suffering from allegations of economic mismanagement and corruption that effectively weakened the Nana Akufo-Addo administration's re-election chances. However, this does not mean that the former president and his main challenger, John Mahama, will actually have a strong chance of unseating Mr. Akufo-Addo. Indeed, the current government has scored a relative success in containing the coronavirus outbreak in Ghana. Ghana was one of the first countries in Africa to lift its lockdown under some initial criticism. However, infections have remained relatively subdued, and the healthcare system has been able to cope with the continued spree of infections in the West African region. So which are the countries that are actually that are least resilient and most vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic and political impact? Ex-Africa has looked at a number of different indicators, including our own quantitative risk scoring methodology, as well as data and figures from the WHO and a number of other key healthcare, political, security and economic indicators to provide this full impact assessment per country basis on looking at the African continent. Here you can see, for example, that Central African countries, particularly the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo and Chad, are very much in the highest risk of COVID-19 impact, particularly the risk of a potential critical destabilization of their political and economic systems. Other countries listed here include Sudan, Sierra Leone, and Zimbabwe, which already had very fragile economies and unstable political systems moving into 2020, even before the pandemic. So indeed, there's still not yet a clear pattern in terms of which countries could see a real risk of political and economic destabilization. If you would like to take a look at our model for country risk resilience or quantitative risk scoring, Ex-Africa provides open access to most of its COVID-19 content for the remainder of the pandemic. So do take a look at exxafrica.com for our dashboard on COVID-19 and country risk. Now let's take a quick look at the sectors at greatest risk of disruption in Africa. Now, obviously, the African oil economy remains under threat. Despite the ups and downs, the volatility of the oil price we've seen over the course of this year, a number of key projects, particularly nascent projects in the oil economy in Africa, remain at threat of potential divestment, cancellation, or slower development than initially had foreseen. This includes some of the large oil projects in Ghana and Senegal, as well as Nigeria and the Gulf of Guinea. And similarly, some of the economies in East Africa, which had very much hoped to join the exclusive oil club in Africa this year, will have to put a number of their key projects on hold. That said, a number of projects, particularly those on the Lake Albert region in Kenya and Uganda, will proceed as the Tanzanian and Ugandan governments seek to build a pipeline and accelerate the development of these large new projects. Just like oil, Africa's gas potential is also under pressure. This particularly in Tanzania, which already was lagging in terms of the development of its legislative and regulatory framework compared to Mozambique. Other African gas projects which may be stalled include those particularly in North Africa, in Algeria and Egypt, as well as again around the Gulf of Guinea and into the Sahel region. Interestingly, a number of gas projects in Nigeria will proceed as large mega projects and refineries are continue to be developed. And in Mozambique, despite a delayed final investment decision by ExxonMobil, the other large projects by France's Total and Italy's Eni will continue on track for now. So, if the African oil and gas economy is taking a shock, but key projects remain on timeline, then what are the real sectors at the highest risk of destabilization going into next year? Well, here we really have to look at the African aviation sector and all its tie-ons, including the African tourism and hospitality sector, which remain, just like oil and gas, a key contributor of foreign exchange reserves. A number of African airlines have started or resumed operations over the past few months. However, many of these operations remain skeletal and prone to disruption because of African and international global travel restrictions. A number of airlines require bailouts, and others, like South Africa's airlines, remain in some sort of a bankruptcy protection. Others, however, like Ethiopian Airways, has been able to maintain revenue from cargo flows using Ethiopian Airlines planes to continue the transport of cargo in Africa and beyond. However, if you look at the bottom 10 worst performing economies in Africa for this year, you can see that almost all of them are major tourism sectors, particularly countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, Botswana, South Africa, Morocco, and Cape Verde even, all set to be have a dismal economic performance over the course of 2020 and forecast to remain so into 2021 if indeed the tourism and global travel sectors continue to be disrupted. So this certainly shows that it's not just countries like Zimbabwe and Sudan with struggling economies going into the pandemic, or countries like South Africa, which remain very much exposed to the international financial system and global economic developments. But African economies that are dependent on tourism will remain those at greatest threat of disruption going into next year. Potentially on a brighter note, a number of sectors will do well in 2021. We've already seen public healthcare, IT and digitization, and even military and defense industries doing relatively well in terms of their export values in Africa during the pandemic. Another key opportunity is the development of renewable energy in Africa, particularly wind and solar and hydropower, where big projects continue to be developed in East, West, and the Sahel regions of Africa. This is crucial, particularly as large power producers like South Africa also are set to open up to independent power producers in 2021, including a large chunk reserved for renewable power producers. Ex-Africa has recently released a report on the renewables opportunity in Africa. And drop us an email at insight@exxafrica.com for a copy of this latest renewables report, which I'll happily share with you. Obviously, the impact on trade in Africa needs to be looked at carefully as well. In terms of the impact of COVID-19 on African trade, there has been initially a twin shock to global supply and demand that has hit the African trading sector. Global trade values shrank by 3% in the first quarter and then 27% in the second quarter. And no full recovery is expected for the remainder of this year. Africa saw 3 waves of disruption to its trade. First from China at the beginning of the year, then from the OECD, mainly the European Union and the US, but then thirdly also from African lockdowns itself. In fact, if you look at some of the African lockdowns we've seen over the course of this year, 17 countries had a state of emergency and 27 implemented lockdowns or curfews. Many countries still have their borders closed, and many of them are still not fully open to international travel. This, of course, has impacted not just formal trade, but also informal trade, a key revenue earner for many African manufacturing and agricultural businesses, as well as manufactured goods. It has also stalled, at least by 6 months, the implementation timeline of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will eventually become the world's largest free trade union. On the more positive side, it is likely that because of the lower death rate in Africa so far, and the lack of provisions for economic stimulus in Africa, that no strict, harsh lockdowns will be reimposed in most parts of Africa in 2021, unlike the trajectory we're seeing in other parts of the world. Regardless, the economic costs of the COVID-19 pandemic on trade in Africa is very substantial. African trade is expected to drop by at least 35% in 2020, with an estimated loss of $270 billion. The World Bank has already said that Africa's economy will see its first recession in 25 years, currently estimated at around 2.5% economic contraction in 2020. It is indeed the commodity-dependent states that are at highest risk, as well as countries that are resilient, that are dependent on tourism for their foreign exchange reserves. And this, of course, leads us to the ongoing conversations regarding African debt sustainability and the risk of an African default. If you look at the general government gross debt, in terms of the countries with the biggest chunk of gross debt according to GDP, there are some usual suspects on this list, including Sudan and Eritrea, who are already in arrears with many multilaterals and have an array of sanctions still imposed on them. But others have seen their debt spike over the course of 2020 and before then, and now are seeing a real dilution of their usual foreign exchange revenue base. Countries like Mozambique, Angola, Zambia, and the Republic of Congo are all very much earmarked by us as countries that are at risk of a default this year. If you look at the debt service suspension initiative of countries that are looking to apply, then we at ex-Africa rate at least 5 countries at risk of sovereign default in 2020 and going into 2021. These include the Republic of Congo, where hidden debts remain a key problem, as well as Zambia, which is already priced for default and may indeed skip a interest payment in the coming weeks, Zimbabwe, Sudan, and Eritrea, which are already in arrears. Potentially to this map here, I can also add countries like Chad and Namibia, which again are very much entering into dangerous levels in terms of debt sustainability, as they are struggling to service their debt going forward. In terms of this debt relief, who can actually apply? Well, about 39 countries are currently eligible to receive IDA resources and to qualify for G20 debt moratorium. Some countries, however, are not applying for this relief, simply because this would almost immediately exact a rating downgrade from some of the major credit rating agencies. Even if the initiative is fully implemented, the G20 proposal simply pushes little more than $6.5 billion in debt interest payments to next year. The G20 is set to expand and extend this proposal into 2021, but it is not yet offering any type of debt cancellation. And this is mostly because of the disputes that continue to arise between OECD countries, China, and many of the commercial creditors, who fear that any type of debt relief will simply be used or leveraged to pay off Chinese project finance loans in countries like Zambia or the Republic of Congo. However, if we look at the DSSI debt relief scheme in terms of its potential savings for Africa, you can see here that so far the chunk that has already been implemented and agreed for African countries, the vast majority of the savings for Africa will actually go to a few countries only, particularly Angola, at an amount of $2.6 billion in potential savings for the West African oil producer, as well as large potential savings for countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. So where will the finances come from? Africa will need about $345 billion over the next 3 years to respond to the pandemic, according to the IMF during their latest October meetings. The debt servicing requirements continue to be a cumbersome negotiation between the various different stakeholders. The US, China, and India have rejected blanket relief. However, many African countries, including some of the ones I already mentioned, as well as Kenya, Ethiopia, and indeed Angola, will need significant relief on their Chinese debt, which already seems unaffordable. The multilaterals, including the IMF, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and many others, have stepped into the fray and are spearheading efforts to try and provide relief for many African countries. But even within the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank are currently unable to agree on the strategy forward. Indeed, the IMF recently called on the World Bank to offer more grants for African countries, which indeed the World Bank can offer. So there will continue to be disparities in terms of how to approach economic and debt relief for Africa moving into 2021. But what we can be sure of is that those countries with economically diversified economies and those countries which continue to attract significant and sustained multilateral and development finance relief will be those countries best set for an economic recovery into 2021 and also at lowest risk of a sovereign default for the next few years. On that note, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And if you indeed have any questions, you can email us at insight@exxafrica.com. It was a pleasure joining you today, and I wish you a pleasurable remainder of your conference. Wish you all the best. Stay safe.